Number one, 25y squared minus 16x squared. On this problem, we're asked to factor. Anytime you see that word in the instructions, make sure you check to see if there's a greatest common factor, something that you can take out of both terms. And we can't take y out of both of these terms. We can't take x out of both these terms. And if you look at the factors of 25, none of those are factors of 16. So no common factors between the two of them. Second, you'll want to notice that this is a binomial. We've only got two terms. And anytime you're looking at a binomial, there's three different ways that you can factor this. Potentially difference of squares. And this is something that was talked about in a previous lesson. Difference of cubes. And then lastly, sum of cubes. So difference, we're talking about a minus in between two squares. And with sum, you're talking about a plus in between two cubes there. So here we've got a minus in between, so it's potentially number one or number two there. And if you've got a list of squares, 1 squared, 2 squared, 3 squared, 4 squared, 5 squared, 6 squared, you'll notice that 25 and 16 are both on there, so we've got 2 squares so far. And then as far as variables go, x to the second, x to the fourth, x to the sixth, any exponent that's a multiple of 2 would make it a square. So we've got x squared would be a square, and also y squared would be a square. So this is the difference of squares. And the formula for that, a minus b times a plus b. And if you've done 11.4, you should have some practice with this. A is going to be the square root of the first term. So the square root of this 25y squared. The square root of 25 is 5. Square root of y squared is just y. And then the same with b. B is going to be the square root of the second term. So square root of 16 is 4. Square root of x squared is x. So your a is 5y, your b is 4x. So when we do a minus b, and then we do a plus b. Number two, 1 plus 4x squared, so factoring. Greatest common factor. So you want to see, you can't take x out of both. 1 and 4, we don't have a common factor there that we'll take out. And then second, you want to notice it's a binomial. A lot of the problems in this section will be binomials. So difference of squares, difference of cubes, and then sum of cubes. And so we've got a plus in the middle, so that rules out difference of squares, rules out difference of cubes. So it could be sum of cubes. The sum part is good to go since we've got the plus in the middle. Sum, and then it's just a question of whether or not it's a cube. And if you've got your list of cubes, 1 cubed is 1 times 1 times 1, 2 cubed, 3 cubed, 4 cubed, 5 cubed, and your variables start with x to the third power, then you go up by 3. So x to the 6th, x to the 9th, x to the 12th, and then so on. And so you'll want to look at these numbers here that we've got. It's definitely sum, and the question is, are they cubes? 1 is a cube, but 4 is not on the list of cubes. So this is not going to be sum of cubes. If it's not one of these three, then we cannot factor it. Number 3, 180 x to the third minus 125x. Greatest common factor. If you look at both of these terms, you'll notice we can take an x out of both. So you'll want to make sure that's written on the outside of the parentheses that we're going to do here in a minute. And then if you look at the 180 and the 125, you can take a number out of both of those. 5 is something that you can take out of anything as long as it ends in 5 or ends in 0, then that means 5 is a factor of it. So we can take 5 out. And then what we'll do is we'll rewrite the expression with this 5 and the x taken out. So 180 divided by 5 leaves 36. We took out one of the x's, so that leaves 2 x's. Minus, when you do 125 divided by 5, you're left with 25. And we took the x out, so there's no x left there. So that's the first step. Second step, it is a binomial inside that parentheses. So you want to check those 3 things that I mentioned in the first 2 examples. Difference of cubes, difference of squares, sum of cubes. And in this case, if you've got a list of squares, you'll see that this is the difference, we've got minus in the middle, of squares. So a in this case would be the square root of the first term. Square root of 36 is 6, and the square root of x squared is x. Square root of 25 is 5, so that's your a and your b. Six x minus 5, 6x plus 5. And be careful that you don't forget the 5x that we took out at the beginning. Number 4, x squared plus 12x plus 32. Here we're factoring a trinomial, so we're not going to do the difference of squares, sum of cubes and all that. First thing, greatest common factor. Anytime you see that word factor. Can't take x out of everything, and there's no number that we can take out of everything. Second, like I mentioned, it is a trinomial. And remember that you can factor trinomials into 2 parentheses. The first thing in both those parentheses has to multiply to be x squared. Also, if you've got plus and plus up there, you can go ahead and put a plus and plus in here. And the last 2 things have to multiply to be 32. So you might make a list of things that multiply to be 32, 1 and 32, 2 and 16. 3 doesn't go in, 4 and 8. 5 doesn't go in, 6 doesn't go in, and 7 doesn't go in. Then you're back up to 8. So this is a whole list. And since we've got a 1 out front of the x squared, we can just look for a pair that adds to 12. 4 and 8 multiplies to 32, also adds to 12. And that's all there is to that. Number 5, x squared minus x minus 30. Can't take x out of everything. No greatest common factor. Second, again, it's a trinomial. So 2 parentheses, x and x at the beginning. We don't have plus and plus, so I'm just going to skip the signs just for a minute. And we'll look at 2 things that multiply to be negative 30. So 1 and 30, we'll put in the signs after we figure out what they need to be. 2 and 15, 3 and 10, 4 doesn't go in, 5 and 6. So that's everything. And since there's a 1 out in front of the x squared, we can pick a pair that adds to be negative 1, the number in front of x. So we can make negative 1 out of 5 and the 6 if the 6 is negative. 5 and negative 6 would multiply to be negative 30 and add to negative 1. So positive 5 and negative 6. Number 6, 2x squared plus 18x plus 36. Greatest common factor here, we can take 2 out of everything, so you'll want to do that. And normally with trinomials, we put the 2 parentheses, but let's go ahead and take the 2 out, and then we'll rewrite the expression, and then we'll do the 2 parentheses after that. So taking the 2 out of that first expression leaves us with x squared. 18 divided by 2 leaves us with 9. And the x, 36 divided by 2, leaves us with 18. And then we've got the trinomial inside the parentheses that we can go ahead and deal with it. That's going to be 2 parentheses. So first thing, both those parentheses should multiply to x squared. We do have plus and plus again. And the last 2 things have to multiply to be 18. And then since there's a 1 in front of x squared, we're going to look for a pair that adds to 9. So with 18, you've got 1 and 18, 2 and 9, 3 and 6. 4 doesn't go in, 5 doesn't go in, and then we're back up to 6 over here. So we're looking for a pair that adds to 9. 3 and 6 multiplies to be 18. 3 and 6 also adds to 9. So plug those in and don't forget the 2. Number 7, 5x squared minus 31x plus 30. Can't take x out of everything. 5 and 31 don't have anything in common. So no numbers or variables that we can take out. Again, it's a trinomial, so 2 parentheses. First 2 things have to multiply to be 5x squared, so we know we're going to have x and x because that's how we're going to get the x squared part. And the nice thing about 5 is there's not a lot of options for 5. The only 2 things we can multiply to make 5 are 5 and 1. And then since we don't have plus and plus up here, I'm not going to put plus and plus in. We'll ignore the signs just for a minute. We'll skip that. These last 2 things have to multiply to be 30. And since this isn't 1, since the thing in front of x squared isn't 1, we're not going to be looking for a pair that adds to be this middle term. We're actually going to plug in a pair and then see if we can get it to work. And I'll show you how to do that here in just a second. So for 30, we've got some options: 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10. 4 doesn't go into 30, 5 does, along with 6. So since there's a 5 out front, we're not looking for a pair that adds to be the middle. We're just going to plug in and then see how it goes. And I usually recommend starting with the pair that's the closest. 1 and 30 are far apart, 2 and 15 a little bit less far apart, 3 and 10. 5 and 6 are the numbers that are the closest. So I'm going to go ahead and put 5 and 6 in, and then we'll see how this goes. So what we're going to do is we're going to multiply the numbers on the inside. So 5 times 1 gives you 5, and then we're going to multiply the numbers on the outside. So 5 times 6 gives you 30. And what we're hoping is that the numbers that we get, the 5 and the 30, can add to be that negative 31. If we add them, we can make 35. If we were to subtract them, we could make 25, but we cannot make 31. So I'm going to go ahead and backtrack a bit, since we cannot get that to add to 31. And in some cases, you'll move on from the 5 and the 6, but we can swap the 5 and the 6. So instead of putting the 5 first, we'll put the 6 first. And then we'll put the 5 second. And we'll do the same thing again. So underneath, we're going to multiply 6 times 1. And underneath, we're going to multiply 5 times 5. And with these new numbers, now we can make negative 31 if The 6 is negative, and the 25 is negative. Negative 6 and negative 25 does give you negative 31. So that tells us what our signs up here need to be. And by the way, when you enter that into the computer, you never put in 1x. We're just going to put in x. Number 8, 4r squared minus 31r minus 8. Greatest common factor, can't take r out of everything. 4 and 31 don't have anything in common. Next, it's a trinomial. So we'll put our two parentheses, and then we'll try to sort this out some. First thing in both of those parentheses has to multiply to be 4r squared. So we know it's going to be r and r, although for the 4, it could be 2 and 2. I'll put that on the side here. Could be 1 and 4, could be 2 and 2. We'll start with the 2 and the 2, and then we might come back around. 2 and 2 because they're the closest. And percentage-wise, you'll see those most often. But we'll come back and maybe use the 1 and the 4 just in case the 2 and the 2 doesn't work out. It's not plus and plus, so we'll skip the signs for a second. And then for the last two, they have to multiply to be this negative 8. So that could be 1 and 8, could be 2 and 4. And since the number in front of r squared isn't 1, we're not looking for a pair here that adds to be negative 31. If it was a 1, we just find one of these pairs that gives us this middle number. But here we're just going to plug in a pair and then see if we can get it to work. So I'm going to use the 2 and the 4 because they're the closest. And we'll see how that goes. So multiply in the middle, that gives us 4. Multiply on the outside, that gives us 8. So we're trying to get the negative 31 out of those numbers. So if we were to add the 4 and the 8, we could get 12. If we subtracted them, we could get 4 or negative 4. But we can't get negative 31 from those two numbers. So what we'll do is we'll move on from the 2 and the 2, and we'll go to the 1 and the 4. And then we'll try that again. So doing 1 and 4 now. In the middle, we've got 8 when we multiply. On the outside, we've got 4 when we multiply. So same pair of numbers that we had last time, so that doesn't work. So we tried 2 and 2, we tried 1 and 4. On the right side, let's try 1 and 8 instead of the 2 and the 4 that we'd done before. So for the double underlined numbers, I'll go ahead and erase those. The 2 and the 4, and we'll replace that with 1 and 8. So in the middle, we've got 4. On the outside, we've got 8 again. Doesn't work, but what we can do is swap the 1 and the 8 because they don't necessarily have to be in that order. We could put the 8 first. Put the 1 second. And then we'll redo these numbers. So in the middle, when we multiply, we get 32, 8 times 4. On the outside, when we multiply, we get 1, 1 times 1. And it is possible to get negative 31 out of those numbers if the 32 is negative. So those two add to be negative 31, and of course the 1 would have to be positive. So positive 1 came from the outside, the negative 32 came from the 8 and the 4. So we'll make that a negative 8 and 4 in order to give us the negative 32. And when you enter that in, make sure you leave off the 1 in front of r. Number 9, 12n squared plus 60n minus 90. $12.60 and 90. Looks like you can take a few things out. They're all even, so you could start with 2. 3 goes into all of them, so you could start there. But you do want to get the greatest common factor, so make sure you're checking to see the highest things that you can take out. And it looks like here you can take out a 6 out of all of them. Can't take n out of everything, so we're going to take out the 6 and then rewrite the expression. So 12 divided by 6 leaves 2, and then both those n's. 60 divided by 6 is 10, and we didn't take out any n's. And then 90 divided by 6 is 15. So the first step done. Next, you want to factor this trinomial. First thing in both those parentheses has to be 2n squared. So n and n we'll need for sure. And the nice thing about 2 is it has to be 2 and 1. There's no other pairs that can multiply to be 2. And then the last things, and it's not plus or plus, so we'll skip the signs. 2 things that multiply to be 15 could be 1 and 15, could be 3 and 5. We'll go ahead and try 3 and 5 and see if we can get that to work. So in the middle, when we multiply, we've got 3. On the outside, we've got 10. And we're trying to get the middle number, the 10. Can't make that from 10 and 3. We could make 13 if we added them, 7 if we subtracted them, but we cannot get that. So before we move on from the 3 and the 5, we'll go ahead and swap those numbers. Put the 5 first and then the 3. On the inside, that gives us 5. On the outside, that gives us 6. And if we added those numbers, we could get 11. If we subtracted them, we could get 1 or negative 1. But we're not going to be able to get 10. So that means that 5 didn't work no matter how we arrange the numbers. We could try 1 and 15. In the middle, we've got 1 times 1. On the outside, 2 times 15. Still can't get 10. You can swap those numbers also. Put the 15 first and then the 1. Then on the inside, we've got 15 times 1. On the outside, 2 times 1. Still cannot make 10. So we couldn't make it with the 3 and the 5. We couldn't make it with the 1 and 15. So this bit of factoring we cannot do. And it turns out this is as far as we could go with factoring. Number 10, xy plus 2y minus 15x minus 30. Can't take x out of everything. We can't take y out of everything. So no common factor to all of them. And unlike the previous ones, we've looked at binomials where there's 3 ways to factor it. We've looked at trinomials. We factor it into 2 parentheses. Here we've got 4 terms. Here we're going to group and factor that way. So that means that in a lot of cases, we'll group the first 2 terms and we'll group the third and the fourth terms, and we'll factor something out of those. If you look at the first 2 terms, here we can take a y out of both of those. If you look at the negative 15x and the negative 30, we could take out a negative 15 out of both of those. So just as long as you have something that you can take out of both of those. In some cases, maybe the second pair won't have anything in common. And in that case, we'll swap the middle terms. But for now, we can take a y out of the first pair. And we'll go ahead and write what's left. When you take a y out of the first term, you're left with x. When you take a y out of the second term, you're left with 2. And looking at the next grouping, negative 15x minus 30, we can take out, make sure you take out a negative 15, since that pair starts with a negative term. So negative 15 is what we're taking out. That leaves the x. And then when you do negative 30 divided by negative 15, that leaves a positive 2. And in most cases, hopefully you've got this common parentheses. The x plus 2 is common to both parts of these. So what we're going to do is take that out, the x plus 2. And then we're just going to put what's left when you take that out. When we took x plus 2 out of the first one, we were left with y. We took x plus 2 out of the second part, we were left with negative 15. Number 11, 16p cubed plus 22p squared minus 8p minus 11. Greatest common factor, so can't take p out of everything. 16 and 11 on the end don't have anything in common, so no common factor. Second, again, this is a 4-termed polynomial. So we're going to group and factor. So on a lot of these, you can group the first two, group the third and the fourth. If you group the first two, they're both even, so you can take out at least a 2. And then they both have p's, so you can at least take out a p. But if you look at the second grouping, negative 8p minus 11, there's not any common factor there. So what I would recommend is swapping these middle terms. So the 22 we're going to put with the 11, the negative 8 we're going to put with the 16. Make sure when you do this that the signs stay. So the 8 is still going to be negative. The 22 is still going to be positive. And again, the reason that we did that is because there was no common factor in the second pairing. But if we group them the way that we've rewritten them, the first pair, 16 and 8, have a common factor of 8, so you can take that out. They both have p, and then you can rewrite. If you look at the second pairing, the 22 and the 11 both have a common factor of 11. So going back to the factoring, taking 8 out, taking p out, 16 divided by 8 is 2. We took one of the p's out, so that leaves p squared. And a lot of times people forget this, but when you take 8p out of negative 8p, that does still leave negative 1. Moving on to the second grouping, 22p squared minus 11, we're taking out a positive 11. Can't take any p's out. 22 divided by 11 is 2. We didn't take any p's out, so that still leaves p squared. And then negative 11 divided by 11 leaves negative 1. And then lastly, we've got that common parentheses here, 2p squared minus 1. And then we're going to write what's left when we take those out. So the 8p and then plus 11.